The pattern appears across every industry, every generation, every level of capability. A person works with consistency, applies intelligence that others recognize, produces output that can be verified, and yet wealth does not follow. The effort is real, the skill is measurable, the hours accumulate in amounts that should produce security, but security does not arrive. Instead, the condition persists: motion without accumulation, capability without leverage, intelligence producing activity but not position. This is not a failure of discipline or strategy. Something beneath the visible effort remains misaligned, and the misalignment prevents what is produced from converting into what compounds. Most interpret this condition as evidence of insufficient effort. The interpretation feels logical. If wealth has not arrived, increase input. If progress is slow, work harder. If position remains static, apply more force. But this logic is based on an incomplete model. It assumes wealth follows effort proportionally, that systems reward work with predictable return, that time invested naturally produces time regained. The assumption is false. Wealth does not follow effort. It follows alignment with a governing law that operates whether or not it is understood. And alignment is independent of intensity. A small amount of energy applied in coherence with this law produces more wealth than enormous energy applied in resistance to it. Tesla observed this principle not through philosophy but through systems. He watched motors operate efficiently when designed in alignment with natural law, and collapse when forced against it. He observed power transmit across distance without loss when frequency matched the receiving structure, and dissipate entirely when frequency misaligned. The difference was not in the amount of power generated, it was in the relationship between the power and the structure it moved through. When the relationship was coherent, transmission was effortless. When the relationship was incoherent, transmission was impossible regardless of how much force was applied. The principle was mechanical, measurable, and absolute. What he noticed in electrical systems, he began recognizing in human systems. Wealth accumulated where alignment existed and remained absent where alignment did not, regardless of effort applied. The accumulation was not random. It was not evidence of luck or favoritism or superior capability. It was the predictable consequence of operating in coherence with a law that governed how value transmits, compounds, and converts into position. Those who aligned with the law experienced wealth as inevitable. Those who resisted it experienced effort as increasingly expensive and return as increasingly marginal. The difference was total, but the governing variable was invisible to most because they were measuring effort rather than alignment. The misalignment is expensive, not in single transactions, but across years. Each day of effort applied at the wrong frequency produces output that does not build on prior output. The work is real, the results are visible, but the results do not create conditions where future work becomes less necessary, where prior investment begins generating independent return, where time compounds into leverage rather than fragmenting into activity. Over years, this produces a gap that effort alone cannot close. One trajectory has compounded into position where continued wealth requires minimal input. Another trajectory has produced equivalent effort but no equivalent position. The gap is not evidence of different capability, it is evidence of different alignment. Recognition of this law transforms the question entirely. The question is no longer how to work harder or how to pursue wealth more effectively. The question becomes how to identify the frequency at which the system naturally rewards input, and how to calibrate transmission to match that frequency. The shift is subtle but total. The first question has no satisfying answer because systems do not reliably reward effort, disconnected from alignment. The second question has precise answers accessible through observation of which actions the system amplifies and which actions it resists. The law is not hidden. It reveals itself through every interaction between effort and outcome. But the revelation is only visible to those measuring the right variable. Tesla spent decades transmitting at a frequency the immediate environment could not receive. He produced work aligned with principles the future would require, but the present was organized to reward different frequencies. The resistance was total. The cost was financial, social, and positional. But the resistance was not evidence that the work was wrong. It was evidence that the work operated at a frequency the present could not amplify. The present eventually adjusted. The principles he identified became foundational. The systems he designed became necessary. But the adjustment occurred after the personal cost had accumulated beyond recovery. The pattern demonstrates that alignment with natural law does not guarantee comfort in the present. It guarantees that the future will organize around the frequency transmitted, but the timeline is not controllable. Most never recognize this law because recognition requires stepping outside immediate effort long enough to observe the structure beneath it. But effort applied without accumulation does not permit distance. The pressure is constant. The demands feel urgent. The attention remains locked on producing more output rather than examining why output fails to compound. And so the pattern persists. Years pass, effort accumulates, but position remains static because the governing frequency was never identified and transmission was never adjusted to match it. The law continues operating. It amplifies what aligns and dissipates what does not. And those who never observe the law experience wealth as arbitrary, when it is actually mechanical. Wealth follows naturally, not from desire, not from virtue, not from effort, disconnected from structure. It follows from coherence between the frequency at which value is transmitted and the frequency at which systems are designed to receive and amplify value. When coherence exists, wealth becomes inevitable. When coherence is absent, wealth becomes impossible. The law does not negotiate. It does not make exceptions. It simply governs. And governance, when recognized and aligned with, makes the outcome certain. Tesla observed this law through systems that could not lie, systems that responded to alignment with perfect consistency and punished misalignment with perfect precision. And what he observed in machines operates identically in the systems that distribute wealth, position, and access. The difference is that machines reveal their governing frequency through immediate feedback. Human systems reveal theirs only across enough time for the pattern to become undeniable. Wealth follows alignment with governing law, not effort disconnected from structure. The cost accumulates silently across years in amounts too distributed to register as crisis, but too consistent to dismiss when finally measured. A conversation that could have redirected trajectory but was never initiated because attention was allocated elsewhere. A principle that could have reorganized understanding but was never encountered because the environments frequented did not transmit at that frequency. A connection that could have opened access but was never formed because the signal being broadcast did not resonate with the networks operating at the frequency where such connections naturally occur. Each instance appears minor when isolated. Each missed opportunity feels recoverable, but accumulation does not operate on single events. It operates on patterns sustained over time. A single day of misaligned effort costs little. A week is recoverable, but a year of effort applied at the wrong frequency begins to foreclose futures that require cumulative momentum to access. A decade of misalignment creates a gap between actual position and potential position that cannot be closed through increased effort, because the gap is not one of effort quantity, it is one of alignment quality. And alignment quality determines whether effort compounds into leverage or fragments into activity that produces motion without advancement. The person working in misalignment invests the same hours, applies equivalent intelligence, demonstrates comparable capability, but the trajectory remains flat when it should curve upward, and the flatness is interpreted as evidence of external limitation rather than internal frequency mismatch. The energy expended during misalignment is not imaginary. It is measurable. The exhaustion is real. The outputs can be verified. But the system does not reward energy or outputs in isolation. It rewards coherence between the frequency at which energy is applied and the frequency at which the system naturally operates. When coherence is absent, energy converts to heat rather than motion. The person feels the conversion as fatigue that rest does not resolve, as effort that produces diminishing return, as work that never reaches the point where continuation becomes easier than initiation. The system is signaling the misalignment through every interaction, but the signal is interpreted as challenge to overcome rather than as feedback indicating wrong frequency. Tesla observed this in transmission systems. Power could be generated in enormous quantities at the source. The generation was efficient, the machinery was precise, but if the transmission frequency mismatched the receiving structure, the power dissipated during transmission. The loss was proportional to the degree of mismatch. Perfect alignment produced near-zero loss. Slight misalignment produced measurable dissipation. Complete misalignment produced total loss, where power left the source at full strength but arrived at the destination as nothing. The power was real at the source. The problem was not insufficient generation. The problem was that the frequency at which power was transmitted did not match the frequency the receiver was calibrated to accept. The same structure governs wealth accumulation. A person can generate value in quantities others recognize as significant. The value is real. The quality is measurable. The market demonstrably needs what is being produced. But if the value is transmitted at a frequency the market is not structured to receive, the value does not convert to wealth. It dissipates during the transmission from production to reception. The person experiences the dissipation as lack of demand, as poor timing, as evidence that the market does not value their work. The interpretation is incomplete. The market does value the work. The frequency is misaligned, and misalignment makes reception impossible regardless of the value being transmitted. Over years, this produces a condition that feels inexplicable to the person experiencing it. They work with precision. They produce outputs others praise. They solve problems that require genuine capability to solve, and yet wealth does not accumulate, position does not advance, access does not expand. The condition persists not because the person is incapable, but because the frequency at which they operate does not match the frequency at which the systems distributing wealth, position, and access naturally amplify input. The systems are not broken. They are responding predictably to frequency mismatch by refusing to amplify what they are not designed to receive. Confidence begins to erode, not through single failures, but through sustained effort that produces no cumulative relief. The person notices that each new goal requires the same proportional energy as prior goals. That experience does not reduce the cost of future action. That mastery does not emerge from repeated execution. The pattern is exhausting not because individual efforts are difficult, but because the pattern never changes. Year 5 feels as expensive as year 1. The skill that should have deepened remains at the same level of difficulty. The network that should have become infrastructure remains a collection of isolated connections that must be individually maintained. The business that should have achieved efficiency through repetition still requires maximum attention for minimum return. The erosion is mechanical, not emotional. The system is providing feedback that the frequency remains misaligned, and the feedback is being interpreted as personal inadequacy rather than structural signal. The interpretation directs attention towards self-improvement, refining capability, enhancing strategy, increasing discipline, when the actual problem is frequency mismatch. The improvements occur, the capability increases, the strategy refines, but the frequency remains unchanged, and unchanged frequency produces unchanged outcome. The system continues responding with resistance because the system only responds to one variable, coherence between input frequency and its own natural frequency of operation. Trust in process collapses incrementally as promised, compounding fails to materialize. The process was supposed to work. Sustained effort was supposed to produce sustained returns. Consistency was supposed to generate momentum that made future effort less expensive. But momentum never arrives. Effort remains perpetually expensive, and the gap between expected outcome and actual outcome widens rather than closes. The collapse is silent. It announces itself not as crisis but as quiet resignation that some trajectories accelerate naturally while others require force indefinitely. that some people encounter systems that reward their input while others encounter systems that resist regardless of quality applied. Tesla himself experienced this collapse in real time. He produced work aligned with principles that natural law favored, but that existing economic structures could not amplify. The structures were organized to reward different frequencies, frequencies that produced immediate return, frequencies compatible with existing infrastructure, frequencies that did not require the environment to reorganize itself to receive them. His work required environmental reorganization. The environment resisted. The resistance was not personal, it was mechanical. The environment was operating as designed, amplifying what matched its current frequency and rejecting what did not. The cost of this mechanical resistance accumulated across decades until continuation became unsustainable. The work was not wrong. The frequency was incompatible with the systems distributing resources during the period when resources were required. Force applied in misalignment converts to waste regardless of intensity. A law exists that governs accumulation regardless of belief, awareness, or preference. The law does not announce itself. It does not provide instruction. It does not adjust its operation to accommodate effort disconnected from its structure. It simply operates, responding to alignment with amplification and responding to misalignment with resistance. The response is automatic, impersonal, and total. When alignment exists, the system cannot resist. The laws governing its operation do not permit resistance to coherent input. When alignment is absent, the system cannot amplify. The laws governing its operation do not permit amplification of incoherent input. This is not theory. This is observable structure present in every system where energy must transmit, where momentum must compound, where resource must distribute across distance or time. Electrical systems operate on this principle. Mechanical systems operate on this principle. Biological systems operate on this principle. The systems that distribute wealth, position, and access operate on this principle identically. The domains differ. The governing law is the same. Alignment removes resistance. Misalignment creates resistance. The presence or absence of resistance is not a reflection of effort quality or moral deservingness. It is a reflection of frequency coherence between what is transmitted and what the system is structured to receive. The law is not moral. It does not reward virtue. It does not punish vice. It does not care about fairness, about hard work, about intentions, about how much intelligence was applied or how many years were invested. It cares only about one condition: whether the frequency of input matches the frequency at which the system naturally operates. When the frequencies match, transmission occurs without loss. Energy converts to outcome with near-perfect efficiency. The system amplifies automatically because amplification is what the system is designed to do when it receives input at its natural frequency. When the frequencies mismatch, transmission fails regardless of input quality. Energy converts to heat. The system resists automatically because resistance is what occurs when input arrives at frequencies the system is not designed to process. Most encounter this law without recognizing it. They experience its effects constantly: ease when accidentally aligned, resistance when misaligned. But they do not observe the pattern connecting effect to cause. They see one person accumulate wealth rapidly, while another, equally intelligent and equally hardworking, accumulates slowly or not at all. The difference appears arbitrary. It feels personal. It generates conclusions about luck, about unfairness, about systems that favor some and oppose others for reasons that seem beyond observation or control. But the arbitrariness is illusion created by the invisibility of the governing variable. The variable is not effort, it is not intelligence, it is not even strategy. The variable is alignment with the frequency at which the system naturally rewards input. The system does not announce this frequency. It does not publish specifications. It does not provide a manual explaining which frequencies it amplifies and which it rejects. It simply operates, and those who align with its operation, whether through intuition, through systematic observation, or through accident, experience accumulation as inevitable. Those who do not align experience resistance as permanent. The difference in outcome is total, but the difference in observable effort is often minimal or even inverted, where the misaligned person appears to work harder than the aligned person, yet produces less accumulated result. This creates a condition most find intolerable: the possibility that wealth is governed by a law that operates independently of moral categories like fairness, deservingness, or proportional reward for effort. The possibility that position and access are not distributed based on who works hardest, but based on who operates in coherence with structural frequencies most never observe. The possibility that decades of effort can be misaligned with the law, and that misalignment makes accumulation impossible regardless of how much additional effort is applied. The intolerability of this possibility does not make it less true. It makes it less examined. Most reject the possibility before investigating it because investigation requires accepting that years of prior effort may have been applied at the wrong frequency, that the resistance encountered was not evidence of external opposition but evidence of internal misalignment, that the cost was preventable. The acceptance is painful, the rejection is easier, and so rejection occurs, and the misalignment continues, and the cost continues accumulating, and the trajectory remains flat when it should compound. The law does not pause to accommodate the rejection. It continues operating with perfect consistency, amplifying what aligns and dissipating what does not. But rejection of the law does not suspend its operation. The person rejecting the law continues experiencing the outcome the law produces. They continue transmitting at misaligned frequencies. The system continues responding with resistance. The resistance is interpreted as evidence that the system is broken, that success is random, that wealth follows luck rather than structure. But the system is not broken. It is precise. It responds to frequency with mechanical consistency. The randomness is not in the system. It is in the observer's framework, which measures effort and outputs while remaining blind to the variable the system actually responds to. The law is simple in statement, but invisible in operation, until observation shifts from measuring inputs to measuring coherence. When something is mechanically simple, it does not feel profound. When something operates automatically, it does not feel like it requires attention. And so attention is directed elsewhere, toward tactics, toward optimizations, toward incremental improvements in capability, while the governing variable remains unobserved. The tactics change, the capability improves, the optimizations multiply, but the frequency remains misaligned, and misaligned frequency produces the same outcome regardless of how many secondary variables are adjusted. Tesla recognized this law through systems that could not disguise their governing principles. An electrical circuit either worked or it failed. A motor either ran efficiently or it overheated and degraded. A transmission either carried power to its destination or it dissipated power during transit. The systems provided immediate feedback about alignment. When frequency matched the system's natural operation, the system worked. When frequency mismatched, the system failed. The failure was not mysterious. It was predictable. It was the inevitable consequence of operating at the wrong frequency, and no amount of additional power or refined construction could make a misaligned system work. What he observed in systems that provided immediate feedback operates identically in systems that provide delayed feedback. Wealth accumulation is a system with delayed feedback. The misalignment is not visible in a single transaction. It becomes visible across years, when sustained effort at the wrong frequency has produced motion without position, activity without leverage, outputs without compounding. By the time the pattern becomes undeniable, years have passed, and the years cannot be recovered. The futures that required early alignment are foreclosed. The compounding that required those years to build never occurred, and the person stands in a position that required maximum effort to reach, observing others in positions that appear to have required less effort, and the conclusion forms that the difference is luck when the difference is frequency. The law amplifies alignment and resists misalignment. Regardless of effort applied, There was a man who observed that identical systems, constructed with equal precision and supplied with equivalent power, produced radically different outcomes. Some operated with minimal resistance, converting input to output with efficiency that appeared effortless. Others consumed maximum energy while producing minimal result, generating heat and noise and degradation despite receiving the same quality of construction and the same quantity of power. The difference was not in the materials. It was not in the intelligence applied to the design. It was not in the amount of force directed through the system. The difference was in whether the system's operation aligned with the natural frequency of the structure it was designed to work within. Tesla noticed this first in motors. A motor designed to operate at the natural frequency of the alternating current supplying it ran smoothly, quietly, efficiently. The same motor forced to operate at a different frequency, even slightly different, produced vibration, consumed excess power, generated heat that had no productive purpose. The heat was not evidence of work being done. It was evidence of energy being wasted because the frequency of operation did not match the frequency the system was structured to handle. The inefficiency was measurable, it was predictable, and it was total. No amount of improved materials or refined construction could make a misaligned motor efficient. The alignment had to occur first. Without alignment, every improvement only increased the rate at which energy converted to waste. He observed the same principle in transmission. Power generated at one location could be transmitted across vast distances, but only if the transmission frequency matched the receiving structure's natural frequency. When the frequencies aligned, transmission occurred with minimal loss. The power that left the source arrived at the destination nearly intact. When the frequencies misaligned, even slightly, loss occurred during transmission. The power left the source at full strength but dissipated before reaching its destination, converted to electromagnetic radiation, to heat, to interference that served no purpose. The loss was proportional to the degree of mismatch. Perfect alignment produced near zero loss. Complete misalignment produced total loss. The principle was not limited to electrical systems. He began recognizing it everywhere observation turned. A structure built in alignment with the forces acting upon it stood indefinitely with minimal maintenance. A structure built in resistance to those forces required constant repair, constant reinforcement, constant energy expenditure to prevent collapse. The difference was not in the quality of construction. It was in whether the construction acknowledged and aligned with the forces that would act upon it, or whether it attempted to resist those forces through strength alone. Resistance through strength was expensive. Resistance eventually failed. Alignment was efficient. Alignment was sustainable. What he noticed in physical systems, he began observing in the systems that distributed resource, position, and access. Wealth accumulated where alignment with natural law existed and remained absent where alignment did not, regardless of the effort applied. The accumulation was not evidence of superior capability or moral virtue. It was evidence of frequency coherence between what was being transmitted and what the system was structured to receive and amplify. Those aligned with the frequency experienced wealth as inevitable, as the natural consequence of operating in coherence with the law. Those misaligned experienced effort as increasingly expensive and return as increasingly marginal, not because they were less capable, but because they operated at frequencies the system could not amplify. Tesla's own trajectory demonstrated the cost of early recognition. He identified principles that natural law favored, but that the economic and social systems of his time were not organized to reward. His work operated at a frequency the future would require, but the present was calibrated to amplify different frequencies, frequencies that produced immediate return, frequencies compatible with existing infrastructure, frequencies that did not demand environmental reorganization to receive them. The misalignment between his transmission frequency and the reception frequency of his environment was total. The resistance was not personal, it was mechanical. The systems were operating as designed, rewarding what aligned with their current structure and rejecting what required them to change. The cost accumulated across decades. Financial resources were consumed without producing the security that equivalent effort should have generated. Social position degraded rather than advanced. Access to the infrastructure required to continue the work became increasingly constrained. The resistance was not evidence that the work was wrong or that the principles were flawed. It was evidence that the frequency at which the work operated did not match the frequency the environment was structured to amplify during the time frame when amplification was required. The environment eventually reorganized. The principles he identified became foundational to systems that now govern global infrastructure. But the reorganization occurred after the personal cost had accumulated beyond recovery. This pattern repeats across every domain where natural law governs outcome, but immediate systems are organized around different frequencies. A person can produce value at a frequency the present does not reward. The value is real. The quality is verifiable. The need exists. But if the present environment is not calibrated to receive value at that frequency, reception does not occur. The value dissipates. The person interprets the dissipation as market failure, as poor timing, as lack of demand. The interpretation misses the structure. The market does demand the value. The frequency is misaligned with how the market is currently organized to receive and distribute value. The market will eventually reorganize around the frequency being transmitted, but the timeline is not controllable, and the cost of transmitting before reorganization occurs must be sustained by the person transmitting. Tesla observed that alignment with natural law does not guarantee comfort in the present. It guarantees that the system will eventually reorganize around the frequency being transmitted, because natural law operates with greater permanence than social and economic structures. The structures adjust or they collapse under the cost of resisting natural law. But the adjustment timeline is independent of the transmitter's needs. The person aligned with natural law but misaligned with present systems experiences sustained resistance while waiting for environmental adjustment. The person aligned with present systems but misaligned with natural law experiences temporary reward followed by collapse as the environment reorganizes and their position becomes obsolete. The observation was not theoretical, it was lived. He transmitted at the frequency natural law favored, while the environment favored different frequencies. The transmission was sustained across decades despite total resistance from the systems distributing resource and position. The sustained transmission eventually produced environmental reorganization. The frequencies the environment amplified shifted toward the frequencies he had been transmitting. The shift validated the principles, but the validation occurred too late to reverse the accumulated cost. The pattern demonstrated that correctness measured against natural law and correctness measured against present systems are different variables, and optimizing for one often requires accepting cost from the other. Natural law governs permanently while present systems adjust or collapse. The mechanism operates through a principle that physical systems demonstrate with precision, but human systems obscure through complexity. The principle is resonance. When the frequency of input matches the natural frequency at which a system is designed to operate, resonance occurs. Resonance is not amplification through added energy. It is amplification through structural coherence. The system begins responding at its natural frequency, and each cycle of input reinforces rather than cancels the prior cycle. A small amount of energy sustained at the correct frequency produces amplitude that grows exponentially. The growth is not evidence of increased input. It is evidence of perfect alignment between input frequency and system structure. When resonance is absent, the opposite occurs with equal precision. Input arrives at a frequency that does not match the system's natural operation. Each cycle of input interferes with, rather than reinforces the prior cycle. The interference creates cancellation. Energy is applied, but the application produces no cumulative effect. The system oscillates without building amplitude. It converts input to heat rather than motion. It returns to baseline after each cycle as if no input had occurred. The return to baseline is not evidence of insufficient energy. It is evidence that frequency mismatch makes accumulation mechanically impossible, regardless of how much energy is applied. Tesla observed this in structures that could not hide their governing principles. A bridge possesses a natural frequency determined by its mass, its materials, the tension in its cables, the geometry of its design. A force applied at that natural frequency causes the bridge to oscillate with increasing amplitude. The force can be minimal: wind pressure, rhythmic footsteps, minor vibration from traffic. But if the force is sustained at the bridge's natural frequency, the oscillation compounds. Each cycle adds to the prior cycle. The amplitude grows until the structure fails. The failure is not evidence of weak construction. It is evidence that resonance amplifies force beyond what isolated force could accomplish. The bridge was designed to resist static load and intermittent stress. It was not designed to resist its own natural frequency sustained as continuous input. The principle transfers directly to systems where wealth accumulates. A business possesses a natural frequency, a rate at which value can be produced, transmitted, and received without creating bottlenecks or waste. Operations conducted at that frequency compound. Resources flow efficiently because each transaction builds infrastructure for the next transaction. Growth accelerates without requiring proportional increases in input because the system is operating in resonance with its own natural capacity. The acceleration is not evidence of superior strategy or exceptional capability. It is evidence that operational frequency matched the frequency at which the business structure naturally functions. Operations conducted at the wrong frequency create bottlenecks regardless of capability applied. The team cannot process work at the rate it arrives. The market cannot absorb output at the rate it is produced. The infrastructure cannot scale at the rate demand increases. The mismatches create friction at every interface. The friction converts energy to waste. Resources are consumed without building the momentum that makes future operations less expensive. The business requires continuous maximum input to maintain position, and the requirement persists year after year because the operational frequency never aligned with the natural frequency at which the business structure could compound. A skill develops through identical mechanics. Practice applied at the natural frequency at which mastery compounds produces exponential improvement. The frequency is not intensity. High intensity at the wrong frequency produces fatigue without integration. The nervous system cannot consolidate learning faster than its natural recovery cycle permits. Practice applied faster than integration can occur creates interference. Each session cancels rather than builds on prior sessions. The skill plateaus at a level far below what the invested time should have produced, not because capacity is limited, but because the practice frequency prevented the biological system from entering the resonance state where learning compounds automatically. Practice applied at the natural frequency, where effort is followed by recovery sufficient for neural integration, produces compounding that appears effortless to external observers. Each session builds on prior sessions, capability deepens automatically. Improvement accelerates as increased capability creates conditions for faster capability development. The acceleration is not evidence of talent. It is evidence of frequency alignment between practice timing and the biological system's natural learning structure. The same person practicing at the wrong frequency would show minimal improvement despite equivalent or greater effort because misaligned frequency prevents the resonance required for compounding. Position within networks operates on the same principle. A relationship possesses a natural frequency, a rate at which trust deepens. Value exchanges and mutual access expands without creating obligation or depletion. Interaction at that frequency produces compounding connection. Trust builds automatically through sustained coherent engagement. Opportunities flow naturally as each party's network becomes accessible to the other. The relationship becomes generative, producing value beyond what either party could generate independently, and the generation occurs without requiring maintenance proportional to the value produced. Interaction at the wrong frequency prevents compounding regardless of interaction quality. Engagement too frequent creates obligation that generates resistance. Engagement too sparse prevents the continuity required for trust formation. Engagement too transactional prevents the depth required for mutual access to develop. The relationship remains static or degrades. Each interaction starts from baseline rather than building on prior foundation. Years of interaction produce a connection that remains shallow, not because the parties are incompatible, but because the interaction frequency never aligned with the natural frequency at which relationships deepen into infrastructure. Tesla identified this principle through measurement that could not be disputed. Alternating current transmitted at specific frequencies could be received across vast distances with minimal loss. The same current transmitted at mismatched frequencies dissipated before reaching the receiver. The difference was total. Aligned frequency made transmission effortless. Misaligned frequency made transmission impossible. And the difference was not in the power generated or in the quality of the transmission lines. The difference was in coherence between transmission frequency and receiver calibration. When coherence existed, the system operated as designed. When coherence was absent, the system could not function regardless of how much power was applied. The challenge is that natural frequency is rarely obvious before alignment occurs. It reveals itself through iteration. Transmit at one frequency. Measure whether the system responds with amplification or resistance. Adjust frequency based on the response. Transmit again. The system teaches its natural frequency through its responses, but only if the responses are interpreted as feedback rather than as judgment. Most interpret resistance as failure, as evidence that the system is broken or that their capability is insufficient. The interpretation prevents the frequency adjustment that would eliminate resistance. The person continues transmitting at the wrong frequency, increasing effort to overcome resistance, when the solution is not more effort but different frequency. Wealth accumulates where frequency creates resonance, not where force creates motion. Wealth does not arrive through pursuit, it arrives through alignment. The distinction is total. Pursuit requires continuous effort directed toward a target that remains external, that must be chased, that retreats as it is approached. Alignment requires identifying the frequency at which the system naturally distributes wealth and calibrating transmission to match that frequency. Once calibration occurs, wealth flows toward the aligned position automatically, not because it is being pursued, but because aligned frequency creates the path of least resistance through which wealth naturally moves. The flow is mechanical, it is impersonal. It operates whether or not the person receiving the flow believes they deserve it, whether or not they understand why it is occurring, whether or not they are consciously directing effort toward making it occur. Tesla observed this in every system he studied. Power flowed through paths of least resistance. Current moved through conductors that offered minimal impedance. Energy distributed itself toward structures calibrated to receive it at the frequency it was transmitted. The distribution was not conscious, it was not preferential, it was automatic, governed by laws that operated whether or not they were understood. When a system was aligned with these laws, power flowed through it effortlessly. When a system resisted these laws, power either avoided the system entirely or destroyed the system through the heat generated by resistance. The laws did not negotiate. They did not make exceptions. They simply governed. The systems that distribute wealth operate identically. Wealth flows toward positions where frequency alignment exists. The flow is not evidence of superior capability or moral deservingness. It is evidence that the position operates at a frequency the wealth distribution system is structured to amplify. Markets distribute resources toward efforts that transmit value at frequencies the market is currently calibrated to receive. The distribution is mechanical. The market cannot prevent flow toward aligned frequency any more than an electrical system can prevent current from following the path of least resistance. The flow occurs automatically once alignment exists. Misaligned frequency encounters barriers automatically, not because the system is hostile, but because the system structure does not permit reception of frequencies. It is not calibrated to process. A person can generate enormous value. The value can be real, measurable, needed. But if the value is transmitted at a frequency the market is not structured to receive, The value does not convert to wealth. It dissipates during transmission. The market is not rejecting the value. The market cannot receive the frequency. The inability is structural, not preferential, and no amount of additional value generation or improved quality or enhanced marketing changes the outcome, because the problem is not insufficient value. The problem is frequency mismatch. Once the law is understood, the question transforms completely. The question is no longer how to work harder, or how to generate more value, or how to convince systems to reward effort. The question becomes how to observe which frequency the system currently amplifies, and how to adjust transmission to match that frequency. The shift is subtle but total. The first set of questions produces exhaustion because they direct effort toward variables the system does not respond to. The second question produces calibration because it directs attention toward the variable the system actually responds to, frequency coherence. The observation required is systematic but not complex. Transmit value at one frequency. Observe whether the system responds with amplification or resistance. If amplification occurs, sustain that frequency. If resistance occurs, adjust frequency and transmit again. The system provides feedback through every interaction. The feedback is precise. It reveals which frequencies produce flow and which produce friction. But the feedback is only useful if it is interpreted as information about frequency rather than as judgment about value. Most interpret resistance as evidence that their value is insufficient or that the system is broken. The interpretation prevents the adjustment that would eliminate resistance. Wealth becomes inevitable, not when effort reaches a threshold, but when frequency aligns with the system's natural operation. The inevitability is mechanical. Once alignment exists, the system cannot prevent wealth from flowing toward the aligned position. The laws governing the system's operation do not permit it to resist perfectly aligned frequency. The flow begins automatically. It continues automatically. It compounds automatically as long as frequency remains aligned. The person receiving the flow does not need to pursue it, does not need to convince the system to provide it, does not need to work harder to maintain it. They need only sustain transmission at the aligned frequency, and the system handles distribution because distribution is what the system is designed to do when it receives input at its natural frequency. This is where understanding produces outcome that effort alone cannot. A person can work for decades at misaligned frequency and produce minimal accumulated wealth. Another person can work for years at aligned frequency and produce wealth that appears disproportionate to effort. The difference is not in capability. It is not in hours invested. It is not even in the value generated. The difference is in frequency alignment. The aligned person is not working less. They are working in coherence with the law governing wealth distribution. The misaligned person is not working less hard. They are working in resistance to that law. And resistance, no matter how much effort is applied to overcome it, produces the same outcome, energy converted to heat, rather than to accumulated position. Tesla demonstrated through his own trajectory that understanding the law does not eliminate obstacles. Obstacles appeared constantly throughout his work. Funding disappeared. Collaborators withdrew. Infrastructure failed. Competition emerged. The obstacles were real. But the obstacles did not stop the principles he identified from eventually reorganizing systems around the frequencies he transmitted. The reorganization was inevitable once the frequency aligned with natural law, because natural law operates with permanence that temporary obstacles cannot prevent. The obstacles delayed recognition. They increased personal cost, but they could not stop the eventual environmental adjustment toward the frequency natural law favored. Wealth follows the same pattern. Understanding the law does not eliminate challenges. Markets shift, competition intensifies, resources constrain, but challenges do not prevent wealth from flowing toward aligned frequency. They redirect the flow, they alter timing, they test whether alignment is sustained or whether it fragments under pressure. But if alignment is sustained, wealth continues flowing because the system is designed to distribute wealth toward aligned frequency, and design operates with greater permanence than temporary conditions. The flow may slow, it may redirect through different channels, but it does not stop as long as frequency remains aligned. The byproduct of understanding is not confidence or motivation or belief that wealth will arrive. The byproduct is calibration. The person who understands the law stops measuring effort and starts measuring frequency. They stop pursuing wealth and start aligning with the frequencies where wealth flows. They stop interpreting resistance as opposition and start interpreting it as feedback indicating misalignment. The shift is internal, complete, and irreversible. Once frequency becomes visible as the governing variable, effort disconnected from frequency becomes recognizable as waste. The recognition eliminates waste automatically, not through discipline but through clarity about what the system actually responds to. Wealth follows naturally from this clarity. Not immediately, not without work, but inevitably. The system is designed to amplify aligned frequency. When frequency aligns, amplification becomes automatic. The amplification produces accumulation. The accumulation compounds, and compounding sustained over time produces wealth that appears effortless to observers who cannot see the frequency alignment that preceded it. The appearance is false. The work was real. The alignment was precise. But alignment makes work efficient in ways misalignment never can. And efficiency over time produces outcomes that effort alone cannot generate regardless of intensity or duration. Wealth is the natural consequence of sustained